We'll do a review of Lakutei Sichas in Chelek Tezayin, volume 16, the second sicha for Purim. In this sicha, the Rebbe gives a whole new understanding of the special mitzvahs that we do on Purim, which is the Purim Suda, the Mishloach Monos, and the Matonos Levyonim, which are unique to Purim, that they are done in a way of bli gvul. And it's the day itself, the Purim day itself, which represents that re-acceptance of the Torah, which is bli gvul. The Rebbe explores why is it that we don't find a special commemoration for the fact, as the Chazal tell us, that on Purim, the Jewish people reconnected and reestablished their acceptance of the Torah willingly. During the time of Matan Torah, it was Kof Aleim Har Kigigis. They were sort of forced into accepting the Torah by the Eibishter putting the mountain over their head and forced them, and they said Nasiv and Nishma. But Kimu, Mashe Kiblu Kvar, when it came Purim, they reestablished that which they already accepted. And the question is, why don't we find a commemorating to that? But the Rebbe says that actually all the mitzvahs, these three unique mitzvahs of Purim, all are actually represent that special level of connection that comes from that special accepting the Torah. Let's look inside. From Posik, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, on the verse, they fulfilled and they also accepted, the Jewish people, in the Megillah. Zogen Chazal, our sages of blessed memory, say that Kimu mashe kiblu kvar, they sustained and they established that which they've already accepted in the past. What does that mean? As the Medor Rabbi Reise, there is a big declaration, or there is a sort of an excuse for the Torah, which means that the Yidden have a reason, seemingly a valid reason, to say, well, they were forced into accepting. So they reestablished now, no more. There's no more Medor Rabba, there's no more that declaration against accepting the Torah. So the Gemara explains, because originally Hashem, Kodesh Baruch Hu, put the mountain over them, Mount Sinai, like a jug. And they forced them basically, said, if you're not going to accept the Torah, so then they're going to die right there. That took place with Shas Matan Torah. So there's a Medor Rabba, there's a declaration over here of saying that they were forced into it. So, is but when it came Purim, that was negated, that was taken away. Because they received it again in the days of Achashverosh. By Achashverosh, the Yidden accepted willingly from their own, out of love to Hashem. They accepted it out of thankfulness for the miracle that Hashem did for them. So they accepted the Torah once again and willingly. So there's no more Medor Rabba. That's the pshat of Kimu. They sustained that which they've already accepted, but now they sustained it because they took off the Medor Rabba that it was done by force. So the Rebbe says this is move on. So it's understood. This is such a big deal with Purim that this reestablished the Torah. So that's not just something; it's a big deal. As a movement, those was the Eden Hamdamut Mekabegim and Torah Medaitom. That they willingly accepted the Torah is an inyan ikri. This is something which is a main aspect. Is nit moving l'chayda. That's not understood seemingly. Parvosmot dit mesaking given to Tom b'mei Purim. How come there was instituted to do during the Purim days, an inyan, a matter l'zeicher from them hodor kiblu mechashverosh, something to commemorate this special, major thing that happens, that they accepted it again in the days of Achashverosh. Why don't we find a commemorative to that special thing that took place on Purim? Although it's all connected to the Nes, but there's no specific commemoration of that, it seems. On Afal P. And although the fact that they did accept it willingly is given because of the love of the miracle that took place to them, is aber fort schwer zu sagen. So it's still difficult to say. It's just okay. So it's related to the general Nes. So it's difficult to say that there should not even be any commemoration to something which was so important. Was the Nesatarut, this miracle brought out that they accepted the Torah again willingly. The Gamarun Shleimus Matan Torah. This is the completion and the wholesomeness. It accepted, it finished and made wholesome the giving of the Torah. Kabbalah Torah Midaitam. They accepted the Torah Midaitam. So the Rebbe is going to explain in his base that actually this is celebrated and commemorated in the miracles, in the special acts that we do on Purim, the special mitzvahs that we do on Purim. Base. Yeshlemer, we can say as Adrabah. On the contrary, this is brought out in all mitzvahs miyuchodos from Purim, in all special mitzvahs that we do on Purim, which are unique to Purim. There's other mitzvahs that sort of we have a common with other Yomim Tovim, but there is unique mitzvahs of Purim. And in these unique mitzvahs, we express the commemoration for their kimu v'kiblu for accepting that. In all mitzvahs from Purim, number one, what are all of these special mitzvahs? Talking about the three mitzvahs. Number one, Aleph, is the Mikra Megillah, that we read the Megillah. And Beis, number two, Mishloach Mones, that we send these gifts. And number three, Matonos Levyonim, that we give gifts to the poor. In the discussion, the Rebbe in the sicha, we're going to articulate and elaborate the precise ideas of all these mitzvahs and how it's different than regular reading of the Torah, it's different than regular friendship, and it's different than regular tzedakah, as we'll see in the sicha. The mitzvahs was in Zeh is mudgesh der shinui from Purim legabe andere chagim b'yom tov. These are the mitzvahs, these three mitzvahs, in which there's emphasized the difference of Purim relative to the other festivals and Yom Tov. As opposed to some mitzvahs we do on Purim, we do on other Yom Tov. Ashenkin the andere mitzvahs uninyonim from Purim, as opposed to the other mitzvahs and aspects of Purim, such as Kriyas HaTorah, reading of the Torah on Purim, Amiras Val Hanisim b'Tefillah u'B'Brichas Hamazon, the saying Al Hanisim prayer during the davening and in the benching. So Kriyas HaTorah we have, every Shabbos and Yom Tov. Al Hanisim in Tefillah B'Brichas Hamazon we have on Chanukah. Isur Hesped v'Tainis, that's the positive, and then the prohibition against eulogy and fasting. This applies to all Yom Tov. Suda, the fact that we have a meal on Purim, that's Mishta v'Simcha. Every Yom Tov has to be a party and a Simcha. So we have a similar and other Yom Tov. So they're not unique, but in the three unique mitzvahs of Purim, which is the Kriyas HaMegillah and the Mishloach Monos and Matanos Levyonim, they are also commemorating the Kimu Mashak Kiblu Kvar, representing the acceptance of the Torah. The Rebbe says, first he wants to point out that there is a difference when you do something that you have to do which you only do the minimum, or something which you do willingly when then you do the maximum. In these three mitzvahs, we will see we're not just doing it, but we're doing it in a big way. Bahagdim, so that's why they commemorate. These are special, unique. Bahagdim, by introducing first the difference between an act that a person does because he's forced against his will, and an act that he does willingly and knowingly. And thus is when something is done forced against his will, or forced to it, then he only does it to the amount, to the extent he has to, and whatever he needs to do, he does the minimum. So that he can fulfill his obligation. But when you do it with your own desire and will, he's not satisfied just to fulfill the obligation. But he puts in effort and he searches to add in the peula and to perfect in the actions, do more. More that is needed, the expected, the demanded because of the obligation. Was licht of him that's upon him. He does it in a higher way. So this is expressed in when we say that they accepted upon themselves and on their children. So now that they're doing it in a willing way, we see this additional way of the impact of doing it not forced like by Matan Torah, but doing it like by Purim in a way that they accepted it. And we see it by the mitzvahs, durch the mitzvahs, which both kisivas ukriyas ha-Megillah, the writing and the reading of the Megillah. As the Rebbe will explain, we see this extra that we do for the reading and the writing and the reading of the Megillah. Also the mishloach mones, the gifts of sending the gifts, umatones levyonim, and the gifts to the poor. Vabir. The explanation. Because on one hand, we see these seem to be like similar and limited like others, and yet we see that they're in a much more wider, bigger way. On one hand, these three matters aren't actually totally new. But on the other hand, they have something added as relative to the way they are from before. So there is an addition to what they were before. That Inyan Megillah, just the idea of the Megillah, is the Kirchidish, the actual Megillah itself, the scroll, the write-up of the story of the Megillah's Esther. As Zainen Dov from Frier, there are early from before the Sifrei Kodesh. There is the holy books, the Torah and the Nevi'im Uksuvim. Afal Pikein, so that's not something new. But Afal Pikein, yet, on the other hand, is with the Megillah, the Teise geworden, noch as Sefer to the Sifrei Kodesh. So now you have an additional Sefer. You had a limited amount of Sifrei Kodesh, and now we added Megillah's Esther, added to the Sifrei Kodesh. How did that take place? This came through a specific request from Esther. She asked Kisvuni L'Doiris, I want you to write me up for generations to come. And this became, as dosis from the Nisim HaKsuvim. This is the miracles that are written. Jewish people experience a lot of miracles, even after the Nevi'im Ksuvim, but the written miracle is the Megillah. That's the Akalponim the Sim B'Soif Zeirer became the end of all the Unal Derech Zeh. So that's about the actual Megillah itself. So we see this special addition, Hisofa, through a request in more than what was there before. And the similar thing is Kriyosa, reading. It's unique, is doch seit der Inyan von Kriya B'Teure schön gewesen, the idea of reading in the Torah already happened, because you have the reading of the Torah, but and generally we have the concept of reading in the Torah. That's not a surprise that we read in the Torah. That's nothing new. The whole idea of reading the Megillah. So reading in the Torah, reading in wouldn't be new. Al derech zeh, der inyan hasipur hanes do bichlal, relating the miracle in general in Yom Tov. So that's whether reading in the Torah or relating the miracle, Yom Tov. On Yom Tov we read about Pesach, about the miracle, what Hashem happened with the Makas B'Cher. So we have this idea. So on one hand, it's something before, but yet, here we have an addition we don't have usually. We read it at the nighttime. For Megillah, and you have to read it from the Megillah, from the parchment, in a public way to publicize the miracle. This is an addition to what there was before. So while it was before, there is already there, but this is an addition. And then Mishloach Monos. Loitves is Mavur in Menois Alevi, as it's explained in Menois Alevi, the Sefer, is in Yonah to Marbezain Sholem Vereus. The idea of Shalach Monos is to increase peace and friendship between one Jew and another Jew. But this is doch a mitzvah. This is a mitzvah, and it's not just a mitzvah, it's a general mitzvah, which is all years. We don't have to wait for Purim for friendship, for Ahavas Yisrael. Ahavas Yisrael, love of thy fellow, is all, loving another Jew is all year round. It's an important principle of the Torah. So what is Purim? Aber mitzad, what is the Shloach Monos on Purim? Aber mitzad mitzvahs Ahavas Yisrael, but from the mitzvah of loving thy fellow is the token chiyuv. There is no obligation as medarf zuchon. You must search a yidden to become the mitzvah of b'havta l'recha kamecha. You have to look for a yid where you were able to fulfill the mitzvah, love thy fellow as yourself. Der chidush in der mitzvah of Mishloach Monos ish l're'eu. What is the novelty about this special mitzvah of sending gifts, a person to his friend, which is on Purim, is mishtadel zayin zich gefinnere. That is the effort to find that friend. Und durch Mishloach Monos, and through sending him the gift, so arois bringen the poil, to bring it out in actuality, and in a way as men sols können gleich nutzen, because the gifts have to be made in such a way that they can be immediately usable. Nit geld, can't fulfill the mitzvah with money, so you have to go buy it. Food that you go eat right away. So you want immediately to do and fulfill the mitzvah. So same idea as before. The general concept of the friendship of Ahavas Yisrael is there all year, but here we have to search for the other Reyacha, and we have to give him something which he can immediately benefit from. That's the unique addition to the mitzvah of Mishloach Monos over the mitzvah of Ahavas Yisrael. And the same thing is Matanas Lev, gifts to the poor. The Indian Hatzdaka, the concept of charity, is a mitzvah b'chol hashana kula. That's a mitzvah all year round. In Purim kum to the Yisrael, what is added in Purim? As is nit genug, it isn't sufficient. Those b'shas et treftan oni, when you come across a poor person, is a mekayim the mitzvah from Pasayach Tiftach. Then you fulfill the mitzvah. Open, you should open up. Unosim titan, and give, you shall give. Over there, you happen to come across a poor person, then you give them. But that's not on Purim. On Purim, you have to look for that poor person. He has to search and he has to find. Not only one, two poor people. And give to them in a way. It's a gift, not just to give, but give it in the way of a gift. That's special. Extra. This means, the Rebbe explains, kibu mashe kiblu kvar. You already have it, but you sustain it, you add to it. And this is mudyash. And this is also emphasized. Euch in the Werter, kimu mashe kiblu kvar, that they sustained that which they've already accepted. Those are was kiblu kvar. These are aspects, matters they've already accepted. You're obligated, and you do them regardless. The Purim aber kommt in Zeitzu, that Inyan for Kimo. But on Purim, what is added is the idea that they are sustained. That Oiftu, the accomplishment from Kiyum the Chizuk, from sustaining and strengthening. And this takes place in the both areas in which we have the Torah instruct us between man and man, which is Matonis Lavyonim and Mishloach Monos, and between man and Hashem in the level of Kriyas HaTorah. When he made the Kabim, Bein Odom Lachaveiro, Bein Odom Lamokim, between a person and his fellow, and between a person and Hashem. Akiyum v'hisofa for an Inyan in Torah Kipshutay. We sustain and we add in a matter of Torah literally, which is the Megillah, the Ksiva Ukriyas HaMegillah, the writing and the reading of the Megillah. Under them, and since we do that, this brings about the praise, unin shavach b'shir Hashem, the praising and the song for Hashem. Mervin under Yom Tovim ben Odom lamoket. This is more than other Yom Tovim. This is the aspect between man and Hashem, in which there is that kimu v'kiblu, that extra that takes place in the area between a person and Hashem through adding to Torah and praising Hashem more through the reading of the Megillah and the Persuma Nisa. But also an Aisof of a Pula, and also in addition, and the act on Ishtadlus Meyichedes, and a special effort in the Inyan from V'ahavta L'reich Kamoicha, in the aspect of loving thy fellow as yourself, or mitzvahs HaTzedakah, and the mitzvah of Tzedakah, which is Mishloach Monis, which is loving thy fellow as yourself, and also the mitzvah of Tzedakah Matanos L'Yonim, Duch Mishloach Monis Yishtareu Matanos L'Yonim, through sending the gifts, a person to his friend, and the gifts to the poor between a person and his friend. So this seems like that the Mishloach Monos, the way the Rebbe learns now, that Mishloach Monos and Matanos L'Yonim are just an expression of additional charity, special charity, additional friendship, Abbas Yisrael, special friendship. But the Rebbe says we're going to see that it seems like, and also the Rambam, it seems like that it's not like independent, just Benodum Lachaveri, Benodum Lamokim. Somehow, this is connected to the meal. The Mishloach Monos and Matanos L'Yonim are connected to the meal that we eat on Purim in order to make sure that everybody has a meal, whether it's your friend, whether the poor people. So, therefore, we have to say that there is something about the meal and the whole process that relates to the special kimu v'kiblu, to this acceptance that takes place on Purim. Gimel. We can, however, ask if Mishloach Monos und Matanos L'Yonim findet man andere Timing for sending these gifts to the friends and gifts to the poor. We find other reasons. By Mishloach Monos, it's brought down. This is brought down from the Shulchan Aruch, that the reason why we give Shalach Monos, it says Kidei sheyehei lekol echad dai v'sipek, so that everybody should have sufficient and enough to fulfill the meal as one should. As it's mashma in the Gemara in the first chapter of Masechta Megillah, the Abaye bar Ovim and Rab Chanina bar Ovim, that Abaye bar Ovim and Rab Chanina bar Ovim, machalfi sudasayil adodi. They would exchange. They would sit down to the meal, and they would fulfill the mitzvah of Mishloach Monos by exchanging the meal from one to the other one. And they fulfilled with this giving of the gifts. Almo the time of Mishum Suda. So we see that the reason is because of the Suda. And so this is from the Trumas Hadeshen that the Rebbe is quoting over here. Similar we find with regards to the gifts of the poor is mashma bekama mekoimis. It also appears, it seems in many places, adosis kidei, that this is in order as lahom genu gave to this Purim. They should have enough sufficient for the meal of Purim. So basically, there's an association from Mishloach Monos and Matanas Levyenim to the meal of Purim. Ufideyas Elu. As Toich no minyonim from the mitzvahs is there came from Sudas Purim, that the idea and the concept, what is the meaning of these mitzvahs, Mishloach Monos, Matanas Levyenim, is the fulfillment of the meal of Purim. And them is the ishtadlus mitzvahs Elu, and that's why there is the effort in these mitzvahs. Chochas b'derech memela, yeah, you are automatically is man der mit mekayim mitzvah haftarech mitzvah tzedakah. You're actually fulfilling the mitzvah of loving that fellow as yourself and the mitzvah of tzedakah. Is in zaydoch nit nikru mudgosh, but over here it's not recognizable and there is no emphasis that kimu mashakiblu kvar, this that they've fulfilled what they already accepted, because it seems like it has to do with the meal, not this addition as the Rebbe brought out before, the more Avas Yisrael, more tzedakah, but rather related that they have enough of the mitzvahs. How do we see it according to these opinions, expression, the commemoration to Kimu Mashakiblu, to that special thing that took place in Purim, that they accepted that which they begin. Dalet. And the Rebbe brings out also the Rambam, and the Rebbe is going to ask some questions in the language of the Rambam. The Rambam seems to also agree that the meal is associated with the gifts and matanas lavyenim. And then other aspect that the Rambam mentions. Let me just verstehen Dalet. So we'll understand this ubehagdim by first introducing as oich das Rambam is mashma kenal, that also the view of the Rambam appears like the above, brought down from the Trumas Hadeshen before, as the mitzvah of matanas levyonim, that the mitzvah to giving to the poor is not nor al mitzvah tzedakah. This is not just the mitzvah of charity. Come on, we'll address Mishloach Monos as the Rebbe will say later on. But right now, we're going to show in the Rambam that the idea of matanas levyonim is more than just tzedakah. This is what the Rambam writes. The Rambam writes that mutav la'odom laharbez b'matis nas evyonim matanas evyonim laharbez b'sudosoi u'b'shluach monos l'reiv. It is better for a person to increase, to give more gifts to the poor, rather than increasing his meal, and rather than sending many more gifts to his friend. Because there is no greater joy and more beautiful joy, rather to rejoice the heart of the poor, the orphans, the almones, the widows, the gerim, and the converts. One who rejoices the heart of these desperate, these depressed, elu, doime, then you are compared to Shechina, to the divine. Shenemar, because it says with regards to the Eibishter, L'hachyes ruach shefolim Hashem, vitalize the spirit of those who are downridden. L'hachyes lev nitkoyim, and to vitalize the heart of those who are pressed, those who are down. So when you vitalize, when you give, and you are mesameach the hearts of the unfortunate, of those people who are destitute or desperate, then you are compared to the Shechina, because the Shechina does that. Then you're Daima the Shechina. That's what the Shechina does. The Rebbe will explain now very, very beautifully all the details of the language of the Rambam in the flow of the sicha. So the Rebbe says, if the Rambam thinks as the Teuchen HaMitzvahs Matonos Lavyeni Bepurim, the Rebbe wants to prove that the Rambam also doesn't think that this is just a regular mitzvah of tzedakah on Purim. So if the Rambam holds as the Teuchen HaMitzvah Matonos Lavyeni Bepurim, that what is the idea of gifts to the poor on Purim is that Inyan HaTzedakah is the idea of giving charity. So B'meila is that Inyan B'matones Le'evyonim Daimel L'Shchina. So then, if it's just charity, so this special advantage that one who gives Matones Le'evyonim is like the Shechina, then it's a Ma'ilevos Yidoba the mitzvah of tzedakah from Kol Yimei Hashana. Then that's a special quality that exists by the mitzvah of tzedakah all year round. Whenever you give tzedakah, you're daimel l'shchina. So the issue is that the Rambam should have this idea, the ma'ila l'sameach le'manim daimel l'shchina. This idea that when you rejoice the heart of the poor, you are similar to the shchina. Gedafta reinstellen be'iker b'mekoyma. He should have placed it mainly in the place in Hilchas Matnei Sani, in the laws of gifts to the poor. There, where it talks about tzedakah, bring this greatness. In which he discusses, he talks about the advantage of giving tzedakah in general. Why does the Rambam bring it down over here? Was it the shaykhs that from Davke zu Purim on Hilchas Megillah? Why is it connected specifically to Purim laws of Megillah, this special advantage? The Rebbe will explain this very powerfully later on, very beautifully, how this associates special with the kind of tzedakah that is associated with Purim, that you give even more than for yourself, your joy for the poor person, as we'll see in the Rebbe's explanation. But in the Rambam, it's hard. If we just say this is regular tzedakah, why wouldn't he tell this great Maila when he talks about Matnas Hanim? And on the other hand, why doesn't he bring down what he says about Matnas Hanim over here? So on the other hand, the Mailas in his Sinat Tzedakah was bringt in Hilchas Matnas Hanim. The advantage of giving tzedakah, which he brings down in the laws of Matnas Hanim, and Yisrael Negolim will be tzedakah yetzibay. It says the Yidden will be only redeemed through tzedakah. Similar, that Monter Nido in Hilchas Purim Megillah. How come he doesn't mention them in the Hilchas Purim, which are called the Hilchas Megillah here? How come he doesn't have to? How come he doesn't mention that over here? So therefore, we have to say there are two separate inyonim. There's a mile in the tzedakah of Purim, Matonos Lavyonim, which is not a whole year, and there's a whole year which has two separate. Muslim Zogla das Rambam. So therefore, we have to say, according to the view of the Rambam, as choch mit geb Matonos Lavyonim bePurim. Although while you give Matonos Lavyonim Purim is memekayim oich the mitzvahs tzedakah, you're also fulfilling the mitzvah tzedakah. Is over toichna v'inyonim for mitzvah Matonos Lavyonim bePurim. But the idea, the content, what is the meaning of giving tzedakah, Matonos, gifts to the poor on Purim? Nit nor the reading for tzedakah. It's not just the idea of tzedakah. To fulfill what they need, just to meet their needs. For the tzarchanim kipshutam, is literally what he needs. Rabbi Iker mainly is that kiyum inyan hasimcha von oni. Mainly, what we're trying to do is to fulfill the happiness, the joy, to make the oni happy, the sameach levanim, to rejoice the heart of the poor. Now also the Rebbe explains beautifully, why does the Rambam add with the poor all the other categories? The widow and the orphan, the ger, why does he add them? All, if they're destitute, they're poor, they're part of the poor. If they're not poor, why bring them in here? Because over here, Rebbe explains, we're talking about rejoicing. This is not just about giving them their needs. The almona, the ger, they may have the money. May not be poor, but yet they are downtrodden. They are not usually so happy. Make them happy. High time is moving for that reason. It's also understood was the Rambam is the koilel in their simcha for matonis l'vyonim. Why the Rambam includes in the joy of the gifts to the poor. He also includes orphans, widows, and converts. The l'chayre they would see if they're needy, so they're part of the poor and the Evyonim. Why does he separate them? Talks about them specifically. If they're not needy, they don't need tzedakah. So how come the Rambam counts them in relationship to the mitzvah of gifts to the poor, matonis lavyonim? But based on the above, as the gather v'toichan hamitzvah matonis lavyonim, what is the definition? What is the idea of the mitzvah of giving gifts to the poor? It's mainly to rejoice the heart. So therefore, this is related to all of these unfortunate. In a light way, in the prat for simcha, when it comes to the idea, everyone say they're takaniyim, but they're takaniyim also, because in this detail of joy, they're poor and they're needy because they need somebody to give them some joy to help their heart be happy. So this is as far as the Matanos Lavyonim we see from the Rambam. But Nochmer, from Losha Rambam is moved. From the Rambam's language is understood as alle drei inyonim, that all these three things, Saisu Dosei, and Saish Shiluach Monis L'Reyev. I just want to point out that the part that the Rebbe explained before with regards to the Kriyas Megillah, that is an addition, both the writing and the reading of the Megillah, that stays. That's not the discussion. The Rebbe's discussion now involves around Matonis Lavyonim Mishloach Monis. Originally, the Rebbe says that Mishloach Monis is tzedakah in a greater way, Matonis Lavyonim in a greater way. And the Rebbe asked, but Mishloach Monis and Matonis Lavyonim seem to be associated, according to the Trumas Hadeshen, with the Suda. Even according to the Rambam, it seems to be that it is associated, it's not the regular mitzvah tzedakah and giving more tzedakah. So the Rebbe proves to it. Otherwise, you see that these are two separate things. So it's not like the Rebbe explained earlier, tried to explain that it's tzedakah, but more tzedakah, or it's a meal and more. So first the Rebbe explained about tzedakah, showing that it's a little bit of a different, it's not regular tzedakah. This is an idea of being misameach. And the Rebbe says, from Loshan Rambam is moving as alle drei inyonim, that all of the three matters, sai su dosei, whether it's his meal, and sai shiluch monis l'reyev, or whether it's sending the friends gifts, sai matonas lavyonim, and also the giving the gifts to the poor, is in yonim v'toichnam simcha. It's idea of simcha, not another inyan. It's not something else. It's not tzedakah. It's not a greater level of tzedakah. It's simcha. Not hayois. How do we see that? Rambam writes like this. Hayois as ein sham simcha gedoylo mufa'ara. There is no greater and more beautiful simcha. Ela l'sameach leiv ani, but to rejoice the heart of the poor. The riber. That's why mutav la'odam laharbe matnes matonas lavyonim. That's why we should increase the gifts to the poor. So that means everything is to be misameach. But he says it's better to bring this because that one verstehen. So we have to understand. When again to the Suda is moving as in Yonah Simcha. Suda we know is joy. The Rambam, how does the Rambam know as the Teuch together from Bishloach Monos Matonos Yonim is Yonim Simcha? How does he know that the gifts to the poor and the gifts to the friends and the gifts to the poor, sending the Shalach Monos and Matonos Yonim is Simcha? Ich darf man verstehen, another question. Was ist Taka de Sheiches from them? What is the actual connection? We're saying Sham Sameach Lev Hoim Lolim Ha'elu Doimel Shchina. Now you're saying you're like to the Shchina. And when do we say this? Yeah, the Rebbe said this is Purim is different than Tzedakah. We find this concept by Purim. But why? Why is Purim different? What is the specialty by Purim that we say, if you're rejoicing, these people, you're like the Shechina? Why is it connected? Why is it specifically for the gifts to the poor? The is the Shaykh by Yeder Nisina Tzedakah. Would seem that this applies anytime you give tzedakah. This is moving oich from Posig was the Rambam bringt. It's also understood the verse the Rambam quotes. Und von deswegen der Mond nicht der Rambam die Meile, and yet the Rambam does not mention this greatness Daimel Shchina, like the divine. When he gets tzedakah bechlal kinal, he doesn't bring it. When he talks about the matnas anim, about tzedakah, he doesn't say that. Choch. As bringt dort in the Posik Lachis Rush fallen. He brings there to vitalize the spirit of the downridden. He brings there, but he doesn't bring this statement that he says here that is similar to Shechina. Why is Doimel Shechina specifically associated with Matanas Lavyonim? The Rebbe will explain in his explanation to see that this idea of sharing in a more deeper way within a even more than yourself is considered like Daimel Shechina, as Rebbe will explain. But what do we need to know now? We want to know that Rambam seems to sell its whole idea of Simcha. Where does the Rambam know that Mishloach Monas is because of Simcha and that Matanas Lavyanim is because of Simcha? Suda we know, but where does we know Mishloach Monas and Matanas Lavyanim? Hey. When it gets to Mishloach Monas Yeshlemer, as far as the Mishloach Monas we can say, as the Rambam learned, as time is Kinal, that why do we say Mishloach Monas? Is Verzorgen to assure as a Zweiter soll haben Eisudas Purim, that somebody else should have the meal of Purim. That's why we're sending the gifts of Purim. But das is a tale for the Chiyuv from sein eigener Suda. Then that becomes part of the obligation of his meal himself. The Rambam sagt, as the Rambam says, how is the obligation of this meal, the Purim meal, that you should eat, and is mamshich, and there's over halacha, and the same halacha he continues, the person has to send 2 portions. And if he doesn't have what to send, you switch it with your friend. Each one switches, and this one sends his suda to this friend. The friend sends his suda to the other one. So since this is part of Mishloach Monos, is part of the Sudas Purim, and the Sudas Purim is the idea of Simcha. The Sudas Purim is the Chayinyan for Simchas Mitzvah. Mishta Simcha, it's a joyful, it's a party and a Simcha. Simchas Mitzvah. So that's why we understand how Mishloach Monos is connected to Simcha. Okay. Now that is Shlemer is Oiv Matanas Lavyanim. Also saying the same thing by the gifts to the poor. Das ist verbunden mit Chiyuv Mishta v'Simcha Sha'olov. That is associated with his obligation of his meal. Zayin Sudas Purim, the person's Sudas Purim. But the Rambam gesagt benegate to Simcha b'Yom Tov. The Rambam already said with regards to rejoicing on Yom Tov. It says it like this: when you're eating and drinking on Yom Tov, you are obligated to also feed the convert, the orphan, the widow, with the other unfortunate poor people. One who locks up the doors of his courtyard, and he eats and drinks, him and his sons with him, and you don't feed, and give to drink to the poor people and to the bitter souls, this is not a joy of a mitzvah. This is just a simcha of your stomach. So Memela, to share with the poor people, is part of the su'uda for them to have the meal. But the Rebbe says, this is difficult to say. This is while the presents to the gift, just like the Rambam writes with regards to Yom Tov, to make sure that they're there as well. The Rambam tilt up them din from Matanos Lavyonim. The Rambam separates the halacha of the gifts to the poor in a bezunder halacha, in a separate halacha. He says, and it's different. Unlike he writes about the halacha, about sending the gifts, the poor, to the friends, that he writes together with the mitzvah suda. So by Mishlach Monas, we can say it's associated according to the Rambam with the suda. But Matanos L'Yonim doesn't seem like it's associated. The Rambam puts in a separate halacha. Befratas, if they're not in the halacha and in the roch shlachers, in this halacha, and the following halacha, it doesn't mention when it gets to Matanos L'Yonim, it doesn't say as far as the gifts to the poor. So when he's drinking, he should give them. Just, you give them separate to the poor. In Hilchos Yom Tov, like it says Yom Tov. Then we move on. From that, it's understood that this is a bezunder inyan. This is a separate matter. That it doesn't have anything to do with the obligation of the meal, which is Mishta v'Simcha She'olov, which is the meal and the joy that is upon the person. The person has to do his own Mishta. Separate in that, he has to give Matanos Lavyonim, but that's not associated. That it's part of his su'uda to make sure that the poor person have. This is separate. Nochmer. Even more, the fear and alkum tuis, based on the above, it turns out, as mashloyach mones matanos loyonim, seine nit kein basundere inyonim bepurim. That it seems like, according to that, they're giving the gifts and pouring and giving the gifts to the poor, the mashlach mones, to the friend and gifts to the poor. Seine nit kein basundere inyonim bepurim. They're not separate matters of Purim, nor a chelek or a prat from the mechivs of the shaloi. They are a portion and a detail from his obligation to meal. If we should accept that both shalach mones and matanos l'yonim are part of the meal, and when you don't fulfill the mitzvah of sending gifts and matanos to the friends and gifts to the poor, is that nit yoitzik the boyi? The mitzvah of this Purim, then he's not fulfilling properly the mitzvah of the meal of Purim, the feast of Purim. Mishta v'simcha shalom is mishta v'simcha because we're associating that. Al derech v'benegei Yom Tov, similar to Yom Tov. Yom Tov, you're saying, if you don't invite the guest, and you don't open up, you close up your doors, then it's called simchas kreisha. It's not simchas Yom Tov, it's simcha of your stomach, and that's very difficult. This is hepech pashtus. This would be contrary from the simple meaning of the verse and what is explained in many places. As is that there are three separate mitzvahs. As it's also evidence from the language of the Rambam and the as it relates to the gifts of the poor, he says, as mutav laharbis that it is better to increase. There is no greater simcha and more beautiful to rejoice the heart of the poor. This haste on them is the mitzvahs from Purim. That means even without this, he's still fulfilling the mitzvah of Purim. Which includes the simcha of the meal. The only thing is, the rest is it. It's not a more great and beautiful simcha. As company to the simcha matanos l'yonim, to the giving the gifts to the poor, but there is simcha. So, as far as matonis lavyonim, the Rebbe for sure says we can't say that it's part of the meal. Even that the Rebbe says, even as far as the mishloach monos, it's mashma that they're not from all places, that they're separate mitzvah, they're not part of the Suda. So how do we explain this? Both. So the Rebbe is going to explain now that the definition of Purim is days of simcha. And to celebrate it, it's celebrated through the various different simcha. It's not a mitzvah, certain mitzvahs we do on Purim, but the Purim day, this whole concept brings out this tremendous joy, which is expressed in all these three mitzvahs, which is associated with the kibbutz and kibbutz. Let's see inside. The Loshen in Megillah, the language in the Megillah, from Banat Melerim Tarois the Drai mitzvahs, from which we learn out these three mitzvahs, which is Mishta, that's the Suda, that's the meal, the party. And the gifts, one to the friend and the gifts to the poor. Is Lasis Oisum. The Pasuk says to make them Yemei Mishta V'Simcha, make them days of parting and joy, and sending gifts one to another, and gifts to the poor. From the word Yemei is mashma, from the word that we say Yemei, it appears as the chiyuv from Mishta V'Simcha B'Purim, that this obligation of partying and joy and Purim is nita pa'ul of us medarf ton. It's not something you have to do. And when do you do it? When zmana is in them talk. So you have a day, you have to do, and this happens to be on the day of Purim. But rather, it's Yemei Mishta Nodosis der Geder Chayvasayah. The day obligation is Simcha. It's Yemei and Atitzoah from their Yom. It is a result, since it's a day which is in Yonah Mishta V'Simcha, and therefore it has its expression in the various different ways. From them is moving. So from this understood that also these other aspects and obligation of the Purim days are those that are the same pasuk, the other mitzvahs. It says Yimei Mishta V'Simcha, the Mushloach Monis Ish L'Reim Ataros Lavyonim, kommen euch als die Zoh von dem, was die Tagufa sein in Mishta V'Simcha. They are also a result from the fact that these days themselves are days of Mishta V'Simcha. The other mitzvahs are part of Mishta V'Simcha. That inyan, this idea, as the Yemei Mishta V'Simcha, this idea that the day becomes a day of Mishta V'Simcha, gewinnt man nicht in andere Yom Tovim, we don't find them in other Yom Tovim. In other Yom Tovim, you have to celebrate, but not that the day itself becomes. And this is the shayches to kimu mashekim lukvar. And this is how it relates to they observe that which they've already accepted. In the inyan was the zayin yemei mishta v'simcha. In the fact that they are days of mishta v'simcha, yemei mishta v'simcha, drikt sich ois, that expresses das was hadar kiblu mechashvedish. This that they re-accepted it again in days of Achashverosh. Them hepech von oines. It became days of mishta v'simcha. This tells us it's no longer forced. This is accepted. When they the Torah, when they accepted it from their own knowledge and willingly. Yashleimar Zayin. As the Indian from Kib Mashkib Kvar, that this idea of that they have accepted sustained what they accepted, that unique way that Purim Simcha is. The main Mishta V'Simcha is done in a special way. We don't find it in any other Yom Tov, an obligation of Simcha. The Simcha needs to be Adla Yada. The Simcha needs to be a lot of drinking. You got to go to sleep different ways we don't find that this is beyond a reasonable way of simcha. With regards to how do we do the mitzvah of the meal, the Rambam says, how is the obligation of this meal? He should eat and drink wine until he gets drunk. He should fall asleep while he's drunk. Where is the mocker for the halacha is? What's the source of the halacha to get drunk? Is Mefarshim tell us it's my Merobah. That's Rava's statement in the Gemara in Megillah. That one is obligated to get drunk on Purim to the extent that he cannot tell between Haman should be cursed and Mordechai should be blessed. So we find this excessive mitzvah of drunk on Purim. Seemingly, is shikras nitkin an hagaritzuya. Generally, getting drunk is not a desirable conduct. And that the Mefarshim prolong as it relates to this halacha, getting drunk on Purim. The Rambam himself explains it as it connects to the other Yom Tov. Getting drunk and laughter, that's not considered joy. That's frivolous. That's hoyless. So how is it as das is gor chayva sudazu? The Rambam said this is the obligation. He should drink the wine until he gets drunk. So what's going on over here? So the Rebbe explains that this level of drunkenness is unique to Purim because we got to reach Purim a level which is beyond reason and beyond rationale. Your simcha, this is the whole idea the Rebbe is explaining, I'll tie it together, that it's all to bring you to a level to be masameach and to give matana even more than yourself, just to lose yourself, put yourself on the side and think about higher beyond yourself. So we can explain this based on the above, that we're trying to celebrate. Yimei Purim is celebrating the kimu mashikiblu, that would they have accepted what they've already, they sustain what they've accepted. Bald as Bimei Purim, since on the days of Purim, what was accomplished? The Gemara sagt, as the Gemara says, that inyan, the idea, from kimu mashikiblu kvar, they accepted, they sustained that which they were accepted. The shleimus sugmar for Kabbalah Torah, the wholesomeness and the completion of receiving the Torah. Is about as the Torah is doch gilu retzonim v'chokhmos shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What is Torah? Torah is revealing the wishes, the wants, the rotzen, and the wisdom of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Chem Gnuza, this is the hidden treasure. Kendos anivra amugbal in zayin yidiyah v'hasoga. So a created being limited in his knowledge and his grasp, and in zayin mitzias, in his mitzias, and he cannot accept it. And therefore is by matan Torah called dibur v'dibur parcha nishmosim. Every saying that the Eibishter said from the Aseres HaDibros, their soul flew out because it was beyond the capacity of being able to contain it. So similar to is similarly, and it's even more force as it relates to this reacceptance in the days of Achashverosh. In order to receive the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there needed to be the subjugation of one's grasp, one's understanding, to the extent that you remove the physicality. As it's similar as it's written in the Turn Shulchan Aruch, the Admur Hazokin, and from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the Reifon had tefillah from Chasidim v'Anshe Maisa. How did the Chasidim and men of deeds, how did they daven? Was hamispalot tzorich sheyirei The one who davens needs to imagine as if the divine is in front of him. So it's explained over there in all the Turush Norchan and Alter Rebbe, they would go into seclusion, and they would have the kavanah intention in their davening, to the extent that they reach the level of expanding, undressing from the physicality, and to the overpowering of the intellectual spirit, until they almost reach the level of nevuah. Purim sein Eden zu dem zugekommen, and during the days of Purim, the Yidden reached that through a whole year standing in Mesiras Nefesh, they were able to reach this on Purim. So, B'meila. Turns out that Simcha, and this great Simcha of Adlayada, is an expression of beyond test. Is moving as that Inyan Ikri from Purim. What is the main thing of Purim? That it's Suma Shel Yom. What is the essence of the day? It expresses itself in this level of partying and simcha. In the simcha sasuda, in this special, unique simcha of the meal, the meal is in such a way, the simcha in such a way with the meal, that you drink wine until you become drunk and you fall asleep while you're drunk. Because this that they re-accepted in days of Chashverish, and that they accepted, they sustained that which they've already accepted. That expresses itself in them was it is mevatel daitei vasagosei, by negating your mind and your grasp. These are kumtsul, these pashtus agashmis, till you reach the taking away your physicality. But that we get by nevuah, similar that we find by prophecy, the Rambam sagt. The Rambam says, "Kulon ein roin chulu elo b'chazoin b'chazoin lailo." All the prophets, they would not see, but their prophecy either in the dream, in a vision of the nighttime, b'chazoin lailo, or in the daytime, after they fall asleep, fastly. Kulon. And all of them, when they prophesied, their limbs sweat, shake, and the power of the body stumbles. And their minds becomes confused. What means that they're no longer functioning in a rational way. On the riber, and that's part of the level that the Yidden reached through the Mesiras Nefesh. And this is what Purim is all about. And the river is simcha, and that's why the obligation of joy of these days of partying and joy in such a non-limiting way, to the extent that he gets drunk and he falls asleep while he's drunk. When it becomes nullified, your form and your consciousness that you are negated. So now we understand, the Rebbe is going to explain the big chiddush what the Rambam says, high timer, because we're talking about the level of negating yourself, reaching into a level which is beyond. High timers of the Rambam, that's what the Rambam says, that it's better for a person to increase in gifts to the poor than increasing the meal or sending gifts to his friend. Although all three mitzvahs are simcha, there is no greater and more beautiful but to rejoice the heart of the poor and the Yisrael. When is the simcha and emes dike and shleimus dike? When is the joy a true one and a wholesome one? Dieser geht da raus von sein Ziel so that he goes out from his own form, from his own existence, from his own being. He loses himself. Und kommt zu Amatze von Loyade, he reached the level for not knowing, was direkt ois, which expresses Kiyum Kabbalah's Terasol HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he fulfills and he accepts the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Kimu Shekiblu, the higher than his intellect, B'shas said is Marbe Matonis Lavyin, when he increases the gifts to the poor. Was the Midba Weister, that's the way he shows, as the Inyan from Sameich Zayin Leiv Anim Chulu, that to rejoice the hearts of the poor, Ruv Be'imaris Mer Simcha, he shows that it brings out more joy, than more than his own. He enjoys more to give to the poor than he enjoys his own simcha. Or even than the meal with his friends, Anoshim Ki people that are in his level. He's only really sameich to give to the people that are less than him. That makes him a simcha. That is the uniqueness of Purim. As opposed to Yontiv, but the chiyuv hasimcha b'Yontiv is the mitzvah samachta b'chagecha. The mitzvah is to rejoice on the holidays. There's no obligation to become drunk to the extent that you don't know. To get drunk, to lose your existence. And on the contrary, we quoted before, the move for Rambam dort genau, it's understood from the Rambam, you're not allowed to. And if there's no poor people or bitter souls, it's enough to be personally rejoicing. And his fulfillment, rejoicing the holiday, he's doing it completely. That's limited. Over there, you have to do a act that goes against it to interfere with the Simchas Yom Tov. But if you don't go against it, it's okay. If you lock the doors of your courtyard, when you do an act to reject so that the poor people cannot have a Simchas Yom Tov by locking yourself up, then it's not a Simchas Mitzvah, but it's a Simcha of your stomach. But other than that, if there is no poor people there, and you're doing some Chagecha, you're doing the full mitzvah. But not on Purim. And in them, Yud Aleph is the Yisrif for the Simcha B'Chag Purim. Over here is the advantage of the joy of Chag Purim. Was the Simcha Dav Zayin Ad Layade, there needs to be beyond knowledge. Hecher from Zayidiyah V'Agbola is higher than his knowledge and his limitations. And Azaz Simcha G'dolim Fa'or Zol Zok Tzicharois. When is it expressed such a great joy? When he rejoices the heart of the poor. One of them is the Rambam Moisif, and that's what Rambam adds. As nit nor darf damol stein in a simcha bebechinas loyada. Not only should he be then in a joy, in a way of loyada, biz yishtaker v'yirod mishikrusay, so that he's drunk and he falls asleep mishikrusay. Was the mitvet niskayim. That's the way he fulfills the kibluha, by giving to the poor and making the simcha more theirs than even his own simcha. But more, by rejoicing the hearts of these unfortunate, he is similar to the Shekhinah. Such a matter as the simcha van atzveiten eden. Such a matter that the joy from a the Yid versus Umlo, which is unfortunate, that brings out by him a great and wondrous, beautiful simcha. Is nichayich ba'anivra. This is not something which, how could a person, a created being, be more happy with somebody else's simcha than his own? You are an entity by yourself. You have a closest to yourself. And therefore his own existence and therefore your own joy by him should be more important than the simcha of somebody else. Especially the joy of a poor person, a man who's on a low level than you. The blois bashchina. This is only by the divine. Dos was Yid can stehen and steht in his apnua. The fact that a Yid could stand and is standing in such a motion, in such a idea, is as the far was it is doimel the Shechina, because it's similar to the Shechina. And when you conduct yourselves like that, is a mekayim dem inyan for yimei mishta v'simcha. You're fulfilling the days of joy and simcha b'shleimus. Because then in your actual action is galib and meluye, then it's revealed fully their gilui from Hodor Kiblu Chashverish, in which they accepted it again in days of Chashverish, their Kimu Masha Kiblu Kvar, that they sustained what they've already accepted before. That is through his simcha. The simcha is the Mailam Medidav Agbola. And therefore, basically, all the aspects of the Yom Tov, the Yod aspect of the Kriyas Megillah, again, that was in the beginning answered. That remains because that's beyond Hagbola, the fact that we added. But the idea of these special mitzvahs, including the mitzvah of the meal, but the mitzvah of Shalach and the mitzvah of Matanas Lev Yonim, those are the simcha. The simcha by the poor person expresses itself. And all the simchas are a simcha of Adliyada. We don't have an exact explanation how the Adliyada expresses itself in the Mishloach Mones. We only know about the Matanas Lev Yonim. But all of these inyanim are in a way of Adliyada. This is Mesichas Purim Tovshin Lamed Vav.